Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Kelly Weiner, and I'm a partner at Scott Legal PC. And today we're going to spend some time talking about the E-2 visa, in particular, the investor requirements and renewal considerations. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Some of you may know this firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder is in the US on an E-2 visa and has been on several different visas, including an F1, TN, B, and H-1B. As such, we know what you're going through. The firm is a full service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in a number of different areas, including E2, E1, TN, L1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB5, extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E2 visas, and we typically process E2 visas that are higher risk, meaning lower investment amounts. We've processed at consulates around the world, and the primary consulates we process at are Toronto and London. We will continue our webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. And at the end of this webinar, we'll send out a few useful tools. One is the PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today. Also a link to where you can download guides that go through visa options in more detail, a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars, and also the webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, and we will send you the link for that. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly upload immigration videos. We will also send you a link where you could set up a consultation if you wanted to have a longer conversation with us. Today, I'll be presenting. My name again is Kelly Weiner, and I'm a partner at Scott Legal. If you have any questions as we go through the presentation, please send them in the chat box and or the Q&A, and we'll get to all questions at the end. So without further delay, let's get started with the webinar. All right, what are the E-2 visa requirements? So first and foremost, the E-2 is a visa for entrepreneurs. And to be eligible for this visa, you have to be a national of a treaty country. So this is a country that has a treaty with the United States. Often there's reciprocal visa offerings for US citizens. And there's over 80 E-2 countries. So the Department of State website has a list of the current E-2 countries. And it's always good to check that because sometimes new countries are added and countries also can be removed. The E-2 company has to be at least 50% owned by nationals of the treaty country. And if you are the investor, you have to own at least 50% and be able to develop and direct the E-2 company. It's also important to note that if you are a green card holder and then you also have a passport, you're also a national of a treaty country, your nationality will not count for the E-2. So something to keep in mind. You have to make a substantial investment. So for this, your funds have to be at risk and irrevocably committed. Um, the investment, how much is enough? There's not a number in the regulations the way that there are for other types like the EB5. And we'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation about how you determine what is a substantial investment and how much investment is considered enough. You do have to prove that there is a legitimate source of funds for your investment. If it's an individual investor, these need to be your personal funds. But it can come from, for example, a personal loan, secured or unsecured, as long as it is not secured by the assets of the E2 business. Could be a gift, but again, if it is, you have to prove a legitimate source of the money. The business has to be real and operating. So, for a startup context, this would mean things like having your website set up, incorporating, having a tax ID, having your licenses in place. If you're purchasing a business, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you're going to want to show things like tax returns, W-2s, 1099s, invoices, contracts, proof that the business is really, operating. Another requirement is called the marginality requirement. And here is the bullet point. We've listed it as you must hire US workers. So the marginality requirement says that the business has to support more than just the investor and their family and needs to make a significant economic contribution. And so what this translates to is you need to show you're going to hire workers in the United States. So the E-2 is not a good visa for someone who wants to come in and operate as a solo entrepreneur or a solo consultant. It is for someone who wants to come and build up a business and actually hire workers and have the business be, have revenues that are significant enough that they support more than just the investor and their family. The E-2 visa is also a temporary non-immigrant visa, and you do have to have the intent to return to your home country if and when the E-2 status ends. That being said, the E-2 is renewable indefinitely if you continue to meet all of the E-2 requirements. All right, let's talk about some options and timing for E-2 visas. So there's kind of two options when you're approaching this. One is you are starting up a brand new business. So this is something we process these frequently, but there are some specific considerations, and we'll talk about some of those later as well. You do actually have to spend money to get your business to the point where it could start to be operational. So you can't just rely on the projected expenses in the business plan. You do have to provide a business plan, but you also have to actually commit money, make that substantial investment before you apply for the visa. Another option is purchasing an existing business in the US. And some people prefer this because there is a little bit more of an ability to mitigate risk because you can use an escrow arrangement when you are purchasing a business. So for the E-2, what they will allow is you can purchase a business, but instead of actually going through with the sale and transferring the money to the seller, what you would do is everything would be executed, all contingencies and conditions have to be satisfied. And then rather than the money going directly to the seller, it goes to an independent escrow agent. And the only condition left that is allowed to be left for the closing of the sale is the approval of the E-2 visa. And there can be an escrow instruction that says all conditions have been satisfied except for the E-2 visa. If the E-2 visa is approved, the money should be transferred to the seller. If the E-2 visa is denied, the money should go back to the buyer. So some people prefer this option, because, for many reasons, if the business is already successful, sometimes it's easier to meet these other E-2 requirements. And then as well, there's that ability to protect your investment and to get it back if the E-2 is not ultimately approved. Let's move to talk about timing a bit. So how long is your E-2 visa valid for? And your country, the treaty country nationality, the country where you have a passport, this is going to determine how long the visa can be issued for. In the sense that there is something called a reciprocity schedule. So, for example, for Canadian passport holders, they're able to get the E-2 visa for up to 5 years maximum. So that's the longest that the visa can be issued for. Another country, Bangladesh, the longest the E-2 visa can be issued for is 3 months. And there's kind of all variations in between. So, for example, Israel, it's 2 years. So it does depend. You want to look at that to see how long will your E-2 visa be issued for based on what the country allows. The other thing that can come into play here is the consular officer's decision. So, for example, even though a UK national could get a 5-year E-2 visa, if the consular officer felt it was a very risky application or they had concerns about the viability of the business, they might only issue the E-2 for 2 years and say, we want to see you back in 2 years to see how it's going. So the consular officer does have that discretion to issue the visa for less time. They cannot issue it for more time than what's on the reciprocity schedule. Regardless of how long your visa is issued for. So whether you have a 5-year visa, whether you have a 3-month visa, every time you enter the US on that visa, you're eligible to get 2 years in E-2 status. So what this means for someone with a 5-year visa is, if they are coming into the US, they can't just stay in the US for 5 years. Once their 2 years of E-2 status is up, they would need to travel and come back in. This sometimes can happen naturally. Let's say somebody's going back to Canada frequently to visit family or friends. Each time you leave and re-enter, you should be able to check your I-94 and make sure you're getting 2 years at each entry. It is important to note some E-2 visas are single entry visas. So, so if you enter on a single entry visa, for example, during a 3-month period, you could stay for 2 years, but once you leave, you will have to go and get a new visa stamp in your passport before you can re-enter the United States. All right, let's talk about how much investment is enough. What is a substantial investment? This is a very common question. People want some figure, some dollar figure. And while there's things that are clearly not enough, for example, you couldn't invest $1,000, there is no set dollar figure in the regulations. What will be considered substantial depends on the type of the business you're starting. It also, where you apply and your specific examiner come into play here, and also the overall strength of your case. So if you have kind of like a lower investment amount, but it's reasonable for the type of business and you have lots of other strong factors in your case, sometimes this can help. What they'll look at when determining substantiality is something called the proportionality test. So how much have you invested in proportion to the total startup cost for that type of business? And you can be a bit creative here in the sense that how much does it take? How much startup expenses are reasonable for a, marketing consultancy? So if you have market research reports, industry reports, you can kind of pull those to see like what are reasonable startup costs, and try to make that argument to the officer. When you have a lower investment amount, so really anything under maybe $500,000, you want to show you've invested 100% of the cost to get the business up and running. If there's a very, very, like a huge investment, the example given in the regulations is kind of an investment to start up an operation that would take $100 million and the person has invested 10 million. Because of the sheer magnitude of the investment, that's likely to be considered substantial, even though 10 million, percentage wise is not a huge percentage of 100 million. That being said, the vast majority of E-2 cases are dealing with much lower amounts. And so for most cases, if you're investing, 100,000, 200, 300,000, you want to show you spent everything necessary to get the business up and running or 100% of the cost to purchase the business. So for example, buying a business, generally, they're going to consider the purchase price to be the fair market value of the business. If it's an arm's length transaction where there's no relationship, if it is a situation where there's a relationship, friends, family, that you're purchasing the business from, or you're purchasing a percentage, it's a good idea to get a valuation, some objective, perhaps a CPA, to look at the numbers and explain why the amount that you're purchasing it for is the fair market value of the business based on, how much it's really worth. Franchises can be a good option for an E-2 visa, and this can work either you're purchasing an existing business that's operating a franchise, or you can also do it almost it operates a bit like, like a startup where you're starting up a new company and you're purchasing, the franchise, or signing the franchise agreement. And this can provide some additional credibility to the business to say, hey, there's an established working business model. We're going to have support. You do want to be careful just to make sure that the franchise still gives you enough ability to develop and direct the business, that they're not, so controlling over every aspect. But this can be a good option for the E-2. Um, there's also, when you're thinking about expenditures that you're making in the startup scenario, there's kind of good, what we call good and bad expenditures, right? So I think very good expenditures are things that are just so clearly related to what a business would need to operate. So costs to incorporate your business, right? Some type of website or marketing, cost is going to be, very key. They always want to see how are you going to market your business? How are you going to get clients? Inventory, costs related to employees, if you have to get software subscriptions, computer equipment, all of those are very common, good, what we call good E-2 expenses, very clearly related to startup of the business. Bad expenses would be things like airline tickets, food, taxis. If you're kind of making trips to the United States, even if it is for business research, it's really not considered a strong expense. And in fact, many consulates, even have in their FAQs, language about this where they say, please don't include these type of expenses. We don't want to see food. We don't want to see taxis. So you do want to avoid those types of expenses because it actually can weaken your case. Do you have to hire employees? And the answer is yes. The E-2 business has to have either the present or future capacity to generate enough income to provide more than just a minimal living for the investor and their family. So you do have to show you're going to hire U.S. workers. Generally, if in a startup scenario, you're going to show that you plan to hire workers over this 5-year period. We generally recommend 3 to 5 full-time employees by year 5. We'll talk about renewal a little bit later. And we certainly have renewed with less than that, but especially in the initial plan, this is often what they want to see. E-2 businesses that only ever have the capacity to employ maybe like one full-time, one part-time person. These are often looked at very negatively. So you do want to keep that in mind, especially if you're looking to purchase a business and it's only ever employed one person. This is not going to be a good business for the E-2 unless you're able to show that you're going to expand it and hire more people. Um, So people often ask about W-2 workers versus 1099s. So, a W-2 is an actual employee of your company. That's going to be the strongest, best case scenario. 1099s are independent contractors, so not direct employees of the business. In certain industries, it is very common to use 1099 workers as opposed to using W-2 employees. So in certain special cases, like let's say there's kind of a construction, focused business and, you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, paying, contractors. So in that case, it is going to be helpful to include the 1099s. Maybe you can get away with kind of less, W-2 employees. But again, that's a very specific situation, focused on an industry where that's really the norm. Generally for an E-2, you really do need to show you're going to hire workers, especially if it's a startup, excuse me, in the business plan, you would not want to say you're only ever going to have independent contractors. That would not make for a very strong application. So in terms of how you prove you're going to hire U.S. workers, so for a startup, you're going to have a 5-year business plan that's going to outline a 5-year hiring plan. Letters of intent. So if you have, people that you're going to hire, sometimes even in a startup scenario, people will hire kind of a part-time person, maybe even to do some of the initial startup admin for them. So that can be a strong factor for an E-2 case in a startup scenario. If you're purchasing an existing business, they're going to want to see W-2s. They're going to want to see pay stubs, perhaps tax returns. So, let's say you're going to purchase an existing business and they don't have any employees. They only have one employee, or they have employees, but they only paid them under the table. None of these are strong scenarios for an E-2. You want to be, if you're purchasing an existing business, you want to look at a business that does have a track record of hiring and can provide the appropriate documents to show that they properly paid their employees. All right, let's talk about an E-2 business plan and what the business plan should contain. So in the startup scenario, you're always going to have a business plan. If you're purchasing a very successful business, you may not need a business plan. But if you're purchasing a business and there's some concerns, or you're going to do, you're going to expand things, you want to show how you're going to increase revenues, you might want to have a business plan in that kind of scenario. And so in terms of what it should contain, you need an executive summary. So clearly, who are you? What do you do? Who do you sell to? Very often the officer reviewing the case is just going to kind of skim the business plan at a high level to make sure it makes sense. So you really want to have a strong executive summary where there's a very clear explanation of exactly what your business does. You want to have market analysis and research. So showing you've looked at, hey, there's a market for what I'm doing here. There's a plan that we have. You want to have a marketing plan. So how are you going to get clients? This is particularly, important if you're kind of in a saturated market. Let's say you're doing, a ton of consulting. Like they really want to know how, what are you going to do? What are your plans here? The vast majority of businesses will need at the very least a website, and often, much more than that. You'll need a personnel plan. So this is a 5-year hiring projection that should include job titles, description of what the employees will do, as well as the planned salaries. And you should include plans for increases over the year, right? So, including a hiring plan and saying, I'm going to pay, financial controller, $50,000 every year for 5 years and never give them a raise. That's not going to be considered realistic. So you do need to factor in at least some reasonable raises, even just cost of living. You also have to provide a comprehensive financial plan for the business. So this is 5 years of financial projections with an explanation for how this is reasonable. So balance sheet, income statement, and cash flow statement should be, reasonable expenses. You want to be able to also, even if you hire another company or a law firm to draft the business plan for you, you as the business owner need to understand the financial plan and be able to explain it in kind of a common sense, high level way to the officer. The officer is not going to want to hear at your interview, well, what do why do you project making $500,000 by year 3? Oh, I don't know. The business plan writer said that was reasonable. That's not going to work well. You really do need to have a general understanding of here's the financial plan that we have, and here's why we think it's reasonable to make this amount of money. All right, let's move on to talk about some, E2 considerations that come up a lot. One common question we get is, should I apply for a change of status with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or should I apply for my E2 visa at the consulate? There's kind of different, it's going to be, that's a really a strategy choice that's going to depend so much on your individual situation. I would say, if you're applying for a change of status, to be eligible for that, you have to be in the US already on a status that allows for status changes. So, for example, if you entered on ESTA, it's not an option to change status to E2 status because ESTA doesn't permit that. But let's say maybe you entered on a B1, or perhaps you were on an H1B and lost your job, and now you don't want to leave the country yet. You can apply for a change of status to E2 status. You will not get a visa stamp in your passport. What you'll get is a 2-year approval that allows you to stay in the United States and run the business. The downside here is that once you leave, like let's say 1 year in, there was some emergency, you had to leave the United States, you cannot come back to the US on the basis of that USCIS approval. You would have to go to a consulate, submit a brand new E2 visa application, and get the visa from the consulate. And the consulate does not have to rely on the approval of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So with some visa types like the H-1B or the L, USCIS will review the case, approve it, and then it's almost, not a rubber stamp at the consulate, but they're doing very little review of the actual merits of the case. They're mostly relying on U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services approval. That's not the case for the E2. The E2 is very different. With the E2, if you leave, even with that USCIS approval, now you have to go to a consulate, go through their entire process, and they're going to adjudicate it as a brand new case. They're not necessarily going to consider the prior approval. Um, so the other, with USCIS filings, another thing to consider that is beneficial is that they will accept lower investment amounts. So some consulates are used to seeing very large multinational companies. They are less friendly to very low investment amounts, like $30,000 or $40,000. We have found with changes of status, if it makes sense in light of the business, that USCIS is more open to these lower investment amounts. Um, that being said, they also are extremely strict about the source and trail of funds. You can see the second bullet point here. When you're proving there's a legitimate source of the money, at many consulates, they'll take a very high level view. So if you say it's personal savings from employment, you can include a few years of your tax returns and then proof of you transferring the money, in a lump sum to the business bank account. If you're applying for a change of status with USCIS, it's very different. They will not accept this holistic kind of high level view. They are going to want to see the tax returns, your payroll summary, your bank statement showing the money entering your bank account and being maintained there. So if you earned $5,000 one month, but then you spent that $5,000, that can't count towards your investment because that's not, you already spent it on something else. So they do want to see a very detailed step-by-step trail of funds up until it's spent. And so that can be challenging sometimes for a change of status. That, along with the fact that you cannot travel, means that the consular option is often more attractive for many people. If you go to the consulate, you will get a visa stamp in your passport. So for many people, that means a multi-year visa stamp that allows them to travel in and out of the United States, gives you more time to work on the business, make it successful. So that ability to travel is very key. As well, at the consulate, you get to have an interview. So there's an ability for you to kind of advocate for your business, explain the situation to the consular officer. And again, officers, will often take a more high level view of the source of funds. So you're not having to do that really intensive audit trail that you would have to do for a USCIS filing. So we talked about the source and trail of funds. So again, for USCIS filings, if you have multiple sources of funds and they're very complicated, perhaps a consulate is better for you. So in terms of loans secured by company assets, so this comes up a lot. So for the source of funds, you can have a loan, but it has to be a personal loan that is either unsecured or secured only by your personal assets. So let's say that your personal you have a home and you take out a second mortgage on that home. That could be the source of funds for the E2. What would not work is something where it's a loan, but the assets are secured by the E2 business. This comes up a lot in like seller financing situations. So if somebody is purchasing a business and they want, 50% of the purchase price to be seller financing, that's often not going to work because the security for that financing is the assets of the business. So let's talk about gifts. So gifts are permitted as a source of funds for an E2 investment, but you have to make sure that the gift giver is willing to provide the proof of where the money came from. So for example, if you're getting a gift from your mother, she needs, and it's from a sale of a property she owned, she needs to be willing to provide, the purchase sale agreement for the property, the proof of her receiving the money, the proof of her gifting the money to you, along with the gift letter. So the important thing there is kind of a gift can't be used as a way to get around providing the documentation. They will want to see the gift letter plus the actual financial documents with the proof of where the money came from. Um, all right, so considerations when you have a small investment amount. So if you are applying and your investment amount is on the smaller side, you really want to make sure that all the other aspects of the case are as strong as possible. So one thing that can be important here are kind of letters of intent or even, contracts if you're able to get those, proving that, the business is going to have immediate cash flow or, has a lot of interest from clients. You can also perhaps get a CPA to review your investment and your business plan and write a letter supporting the investment and explaining this is a reasonable amount and a solid financial plan for this type of business. You often want to get a CPA that kind of is working with your type of business or in your industry or with smaller companies to help that carry more weight. Uh, E2 visas for two investors. So this is possible, but if there's both people want to be investors, then the ownership has to be 50-50. So that's something to keep in mind. Um, Substantive changes to the business after filing. This comes up a lot. People sometimes get a visa, particularly if they get a 4 or 5 year visa. Maybe business circumstances change and they don't realize that, that can impact their visa status. So when there's going to be a change to your E2 business, it's important to consult with an attorney to figure out, is this a substantial change that is going to require an additional amendment filing or another filing at the consulate? Or is this kind of a natural outgrowth of the business that, reasonably can be incorporated, right? So let's say you were doing, software consulting, but your initial E2 business plan also contemplated mobile app development is something you were going to do. So maybe year 3, you start your mobile app development and that becomes the major part of the business. That's okay. You likely don't need to go back or do anything because it was contemplated in your initial business plan that this was something you were going to do. And even though the software consulting is a little bit less, that's kind of the market forces at work and you've disclosed what you were planning to do anyway. A substantive change that would be a problem is, let's say you were running like a wedding photography business and you don't want to run that anymore. You stop doing that and you open up a restaurant. So this is obviously a very big change. You're only permitted to run the type of business that you represented to the consulate. And again, within that business plan, you could contemplate different things. But if making a major change without getting an approval first is a status violation, right? So if you're that wedding photographer and you've shut down your business and now you're running this restaurant on your E2 visa, even if it's the same company, it's a status violation because there was a substantial change. And if you wanted to avoid a status violation, what you would have had to do is either apply with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for like indicate there's a substantial change, here's the additional investment, or go back to the consulate and get a new E2 visa for the new type of business. So you always, if you're contemplating that change, you want to talk to an attorney or, make those filings before the change happens because doing it afterwards means, you were violating your status. You also want to think about, what type of business you're running because there are some kind of higher risk areas for the E2, and we've listed them here. And we actually have a separate presentation that goes over each of these in more detail and describes kind of some strategies you can use to help, make this better. But so real estate. So anytime an officer sees it's a real estate type of business, there's going to be extra scrutiny. They're very sensitive to people kind of purchasing a property and just collecting passive rental income, or, flipping one house. These are things that they don't like. They don't feel like these are kind of active enough businesses. There's an element of it's passive, it's not real and operating, it's not going to hire workers. So you do want to, if you're doing real estate, really consider how can you show this is an active business. If you're doing house flipping, it would need to be on a very large scale. If you're doing, kind of if you're a broker, anything that requires a license, making sure you have a license. That can be very relevant. It's similar with equity trading. Again, their concerns are, is this too passive? Is the business real and operating? Is it going to, support employees? And also, do you have appropriate licenses? Family business purchases are also quite high risk. I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, but ultimately, the risk here is that they will feel that that you're really not paying the fair market value. So you do want to, make sure that the source of funds is clear, make sure that often having, business attorneys drafting the purchase sale agreement is recommended, to show this is actually a formal transaction, even though it is a family business purchase. In no circumstance can kind of your family member who owns the business gift you the money to buy the business. That's not going to work. So there are some considerations there. You should always talk, carefully with your attorney before engaging, in a family business purchase for an E-2. All right, let's talk about some common reasons for E-2 denials. One is low investment amount. There's some investments are just too low. We had someone come to us after they had applied on their own and been denied. They had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. That's just not going to be enough to show that you are, committed to running the business, that you've invested a substantial amount, that it's irrevocably committed and at risk. Money that's just sitting in a business bank account can be transferred. So they don't view that as sufficient. Uh, in that instance, there's an ability to kind of spend more money, reapply. We were able to guide this client. They ended up, spending around $50,000 and ultimately were approved. So some investment amounts will just be too low. Nature of the business. So I just spoke about this, right? Real estate, equity, family business purchases. Sometimes there's things, that will make the case more high risk. And so you do need to take that into account when you're deciding what type of business to start. Filing location, venue is very important. Although the law is the same, consulates will often interpret what is substantial differently. Particularly, again, some consulates are very used to seeing huge companies that are investing millions of dollars and sending over only E-2 employees. They're less familiar with, the small business owner who's investing $80,000, to start up a law firm or start up a consulting company. You do want to think strategically, with your attorney about what are your options. Often you'll need to apply in your home country, especially if you're residing there. That being said, sometimes there's other options, like we talked about with the change of status, or if you have ties to another country, or let's say you're living in the United States on another type of visa, sometimes there's an ability to apply elsewhere. So it is important to have that conversation to see what your options are, because some consulates are much less friendly to smaller business owners and smaller investments. Uh, so the next bullet point, kind of speaks to this marginality requirement. We've talked a lot about the importance of hiring U.S. workers for the E-2. If they see you have had a business in your home country for many years that has no employees, like spent 10 years as a solo consultant, they may not be convinced by a 5-year business plan, because they will say, well, your history demonstrates that are not going to hire someone. So in that sense, you may decide, well, it's better to hire somebody before I apply. Even though there's a bit more risk there, you'll have to spend a bit more money. It does answer this concern they might have about whether or not you truly intend to hire employees in the US. Another reason can be issues with the adjudicating officer. Consular officers are human beings. Some of them have, bad days. Some of them are being trained or have a misunderstanding of the law. Um, you know, some of them just interpret kind of the regulations, differently or more strictly than kind of other places. So if you do have issues with an officer, it's, you always want to be respectful. They ultimately have complete discretion over whether your visa is granted or not. And there's no real appeal there. You can always reapply, or if you feel there was a major legal error, there's certain, avenues you can pursue. But generally, you want to be as polite as possible, ask them what they were unhappy with, usually if you reapply, most consulates will try to give you a different officer than the one who initially denied you. They don't guarantee it, but in our experience, they do really try to do that. Um, Another reason might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. Sometimes people will file on their own or file with, someone who's not as familiar with the regulations. Maybe they filed and the entire, investment is secured by the E-2 company. So now there's no investment, or perhaps you don't, own or control the business. Treaty country nationals don't own and control the business. If you don't meet those requirements, you can always try to, see if there's an ability to rehabilitate those issues and reapply. All right, let's talk about renewing an E-2 visa. So, if you've gotten the visa, now you're at the renewal stage. What does it take to kind of get the renewal E-2 approved? So, for this, they really want to see, that you've hired U.S. workers. So, again, we recommend 3 to 5, full-time workers by year 5. It's possible to renew with less, but it's going to, be riskier. And you want to kind of provide a very compelling narrative, a persuasive narrative explaining how the business is going to succeed, hire more people. They want to see updated financial data. So tax returns usually for at least 2 years. Sometimes some consulates will ask for, let's say it was 5-year visa. Some consulates will ask for the full 5 years of tax returns, since your approval. They'll want to see, is the company profitable? Is the company, are revenues, growing? Or if they are stagnant or they're decreasing, is there a plan to get them back on track? They'll want to provide, they'll want to see payroll information. W-2s, proof that you've hired. If you've paid a lot of 1099s and that's really a substantial part of your business, you can include that as well. If the company's not doing well, you can submit kind of a supplementary business plan almost that explains, here's our plans for hiring, here's why they're realistic. They'll also want to make sure the company still meets the E-2 requirements. So if there's been any changes to the ownership that would impact, whether or not, the investor is still owning 50%, that could be an issue. If you have a type of company where there's going to be kind of, financing or people are going to take shares, you want to always remember it's important to show that you still, treaty country nationals still own 50% of the business and the investor has to own 50% of the business. If there's been changes to the type of business, this can be, significant. So as I described previously, substantial changes where you didn't get an approval ahead of time can lead to problems. So if that wedding photographer, just kept running her restaurant and went back, to renew it and said, yes, I have a restaurant now, that's going to be a major issue at that point. So that's why you need to do that, ahead of time before those changes are made. However, it is important to note if there's changes to the business and they are again like a natural outgrowth of just market forces, like you are a marketing consultancy focused on, the wellness space, but you ended up getting a ton of clients in finance. And so now you're a marketing consultancy focused on finance clients. That's not a problem. That's not going to be considered a substantial change. You're still providing the same service, just to a different, niche set of clients. All right. So some developments and adjudication trends and considerations for the E-2. So one is that the E-2 visas generally do have high approval rates. The U.S. government posts, statistics about this, each year, and approvals are 80 to 90%. It is important to remember, this will vary a lot based on consulate. So some consulates have very high, are issuing a lot of E-2 visas. Some are not, some are harder. So that goes back to wanting to have that conversation, with your attorney to understand, what type of consulate you're going to. One thing we saw in the past and we think we'll continue to, kind of see moving forward is a focus on investment purchases in the United States. So the law does not require that you invest, when you make your investment, it doesn't require that you use US vendors or make the investment in the US. For example, if you're buying a lot of inventory and it's, from your home country, that's okay. You can make that expenditure there. However, the E-2 visa is meant to facilitate kind of, economic benefit between the U.S. and the treaty country. And it is a focus, where the consular officers will often ask, did you, how much did you spend in the U.S.? And so this is something they're starting to focus on, and something that, should be, in your mind as you're making your expenditures. If you have the option to, pay for a website developer in Canada or in the U.S., you should pay in the U.S. It's going to be stronger for the application. Uh, Government is, going to want higher investment amounts. I think generally across the spectrum in immigration, we're going to see, and we are seeing it in this area, although there weren't major changes last time, uh, you know, and we haven't seen major changes to the program this time, there's always a trend towards higher investment amounts. So higher investment amounts are going to be stronger cases, and, that's something to keep in mind. Hiring U.S. citizens. Like the marginality requirement says you have to hire people. It doesn't specify they have to be U.S. citizens. That being said, it is looked upon more favorably if you are hiring U.S. citizens. An executive order that was kind of in the last administration, the last time that 2016 to 2020. There was an executive order called Buy American, Hire American, and so there's a lot of focus on that. That can be beneficial for your application. They may, if you're trying to bring over E2 employees, there could be more questions on kind of why can't a U.S. worker do this job? So you do want to have, a strong record of hiring U.S. workers, and particularly U.S. citizens and green card holders in the U.S. Um, you do want to focus on employees rather than contractors. As I described earlier, there's certain industries where having, a very high volume of contractors where you're spending a lot of money, then that can be beneficial, but employees are going to be stronger. Administrative processing. So, in the vein of there's an executive order that asks for kind of maximum vetting of all foreign nationals applying for a visa. We can anticipate that we will start to see higher rates of administrative processing. There's kind of two ways that administrative processing can play out. One is if you go to your visa interview and they just have some, like document requests, they want something you to send them something so they can review it and make a final decision. Usually those can be sorted out within a few weeks, maybe a month. Because the consulate is in control there, they just need to review the documents and make a final decision. Administrative processing can also take much longer if, for example, the case is flagged by another agency for a security concern or in the background check or the fingerprint check, there was something that came up as problematic. Those types of administrative processing cases can take a lot longer to resolve. This would be where you go for your E2 interview. And instead of approving or denying you, they issue you Form 221G that says you're in administrative processing. In that case, all you can really do is follow up every, 30 to 60 to 90 days, because ultimately the consulate themselves don't have the ability to move the case forward until whatever agency, flagged the case releases it. So we will likely start to see that as, there's more focus on kind of vetting, any visa applicant. So more USCIS filings. So given the concerns about travel, about administrative processing at consulates, sometimes people are more nervous to travel, especially with kind of what's happening in the media. There might be more USCIS filings, so more changes of status. So, this is something where, I earlier in the presentation described, what, the pros and cons of a change of status. We think we will start to see this, more, moving forward. Also, longer waits at consulates. So there is a focus on, letting go of many, workers in the federal government, and this includes the State Department. And so, to the extent there are less foreign service officers available to adjudicate visa applications, and run all the other, elements of a consulate, we may start to see longer wait times for appointments because there will be, less employees to do the interviews. All right. So we've reached the end of the presentation. We'll see if any questions. Doesn't look like any have come in. All right. So I will close here. Thank you, everyone, for participating. I hope you have a wonderful day.